Hello all, welcome to our conference presentation for AMPS, Cities in a Changing World. We'd like to thank the entire AMPS conference team and City Tech, including our own Professor Jason Montgomery, for all their work and effort to produce and host this event. My name is Kenneth Conzelmann. I serve on the faculty at City Tech, and I'm also a practicing architect in New York. Together with former City Tech students Tea Kabalishvili and Professor Christian Camacho, now a professor, we've created a kind of picture book where the images are empowered to do most of the talking, so to speak. Next slide. Spirit of place. How the qualities and conditions of our physical environment affect our state of mind. Next slide. Here's our outline of our 9 chapters. We have home, work, pre-industrial, work, industrial onset, home and work separate, the space between, COVID-19 strikes, we watch, protest, learn, adapt. We innovate, we envision, we act. Next slide. Home, work. And here I'd like to introduce Professor Camacho to narrate.
Home has various meanings to many cultures. Some cultures do not even have a word for this meaning. Regardless of the culture or geographic location of the concept of home, they all maintain a common idea. The idea of safety, protection, security, and a moment of pause and even celebration. The idea of work in this case is not one to make a profit, but rather one of survival. The place of work can be considered the areas around this hut, where dangers lurk and safety is not there. Smiths were specialists at their craft. They worked and provided a living for themselves, as did many others in other specialties. Their lifestyle was in fact their work. Most of them lived in the same location as the place of work. Being a gunsmith in colonial America required several specialized skills in working with metal and wood. Apprenticeships for learning the trade could take up to 7 years. The image shown is of a metallurgical worker. Before the Industrial Revolution, much of the workforce was agriculture and farming, which was directly connected to the concept of home. Both work and home were essentially in the same place. In 1790, the total U.S. population was 3,900,000. Farmers made up about 90% of the labor workforce. Prior to the Industrial Revolution, the home was mainly constructed around the concept of farming, agriculture, and a local economy that was provided by a family of services to their local community: smiths, printers, cobblers, etc.
As cottage industries began to outgrow their home-based shops, larger manufacturing buildings were planned and constructed. Here we have weavers, glass blowers, and machinery. Next slide. Heavy industries began to proliferate around the world, creating industrial work belts, regions planned for and dominated by major and massive factories and manufacturing. So the home and the work separate. Next slide. And again, the home and work separate. Here we have some images from 18th century European offices and a residence. Next slide. Saltbox House around 1790. Again, example of the separation of home and work. Next slide. And here in New York City, we have example of separation of home and work.
Slowly after the Industrial Revolution and the advent of the office space, it began to change the way that a home was depicted, but it was the first time in history where the home has become fully disconnected with its ties to the concept of work. It is the first time where the home was about cleansing oneself from the filth of work, leaving us with an architecture that celebrates sharpness, cleanliness, and good hygiene. After the Industrial Revolution, it has radically changed the way we live within our homes, as well as how we create our homes. This program has become an incredibly curated way of living, one that is constructed around the needs of a 21st century human, hence this machine for living.
In the mid-20th century, corporate campuses or office parks began to proliferate around the country. Here we have an image of the General Motors Technical Center. This is taken from one of their original brochures, and you see on the upper right an image of the ideal American suburban home and family. Next.
The home has eventually turned into a place of pause, to the point where many cities contained homes that became empty for a period of time during the day. Work and home eventually reached a point where they were completely separated, both mentally and physically, leaving behind empty spaces in the mornings, waiting to be inhabited once again in the evenings.
Chapter 4, The Space Between, or the Third Place.
As the physical distancing of home and work increased, it inherently created a space between, the commute, aka the big mix, to transform house dwellers to working citizens. The space between became an infrastructure that we know today existent in every city and landscape.
There's also the phenomenon of the third place, or the space between. For many, this entails the commute from home to work, the subway, the bus, the commuter train, the car, the bike ride, the walk to work, or the airplane flight for weekly meetings in DC. For those travel methods which result in carbon release contributing to global warming, yes, this is a good thing for them to be shut or diminished. But our daily experience of the interstitial space, the time and space between, that big mixed realm between our homes and our workplaces and beyond, can be a vital source of cultural, social, and community connection, engagement, and inspiration. The modern day agora, if you will. Next slide. Here we have images of all kinds of vehicular transportation. Images again of pedestrians commuting en masse around the world. Chapter 5, COVID-19 strikes. Space is empty. Self-isolation, fear, desolation, and the not-so-quiet panic begins. Next slide. Humankind. The Pseudoloon by Michael Webb with Archigram 1967, quote, clothing for living in, or if it weren't for my Pseudoloon, I would have to buy a house. These are words of Michael Webb. Little excerpt here. They prepare the space for a selective isolation, transforming the user into a socially autonomous person, yet dependent on the available technology. A suit that covers all the basic necessities for living, and it can become an inflatable chamber for living. Food for thought. Next. Here we have the Viennese group, Haus Rücker, from a 1967 project. Their work explored the potential of architecture through installations and happenings using pneumatic structures or prosthetic devices that altered perceptions of space and to help conjure a new form of utopia. And again, here we have what seems to be an apartment tropical bubble extension by Hausrucker. Here we have what's known as Space Buster by Raumleber Berlin, a group based in Berlin. They're urban visionaries and architects. This is a near instant inflatable space, which they set up. They're able to move around the city and set up in various contexts. And they did that when they were visiting about 10 years ago. Places like Meatpacking District and also actually under the High Line.
Buckminster Fuller in 1960 to put a giant geodesic dome over Midtown Manhattan. The purpose of the dome was to regulate the weather and reduce air pollution. An almost perfectly hermetically sealed environment, Tesla has created and sold more than 500,000 vehicles in the past year. It has become something that has heightened the self-isolation paranoia that has happened within cities.
COVID-19 has confined most people to their homes and has physically disconnected the home from work, leaving empty streets and the space between. Next slide. Empty spaces and places. Next slide. Empty spaces and places. Empty spaces and places. Empty city, the great exodus, or at least for those who could. Next slide. Chapter 6, we watch, we protest, we learn, we adapt. Next slide. Protocols to help prevent the spread. Social distancing, of course. Social distancing.
Personal protective equipment was something that highlighted the division in the classes between the poor and the wealthier societies.
Here we have city lockdown and urban blight. Next slide. The world saw rioting. Next slide. Protests. And conformity with patience, please. Next slide. And the virtual connection, or not. Outdoor dining shacks, sheds, and bubbles. And air. And the great outdoors. And its rediscovery. Night and day. And the new normal. So here's a creek house, which was built when OSB wood panels was about $10 a sheet. Today it's 5 to 6 times that cost, as you can see on the right. With most folks at home, home improvement projects went through the roof, so to speak, leaving the few or no construction workers available. Carpenters, plumbers, electricians are in high demand still to this day. Home improvement services are unavailable, out of reach, or out of budget. Next slide. Here we have an image. The city identified certain residential streets as open streets, actually closed streets, and have been provided with movable barricades to reduce traffic flow and to allow for more outdoor space in the streets for the actual local residents. This allows and encourages local communities to engage and to take part. This was, in my opinion, very, very successful, and hopefully it'll find its way into something more formal. And here we have the Javits Center, pun intended. Chapter 7, we innovate. How does a physical space or place form, inspire, influence a mental, emotional, psychological posturing, a mindset framing to best approach specific chores or decision making or creative endeavors? How does putting on a necktie, walking around the block, and returning to the bedroom to Zoom meet with a client or teach a class help conjure a psychological transformation in one's own mind, frame of mind, and posture? As designing and implementing a physical transformation for designed work from home space, for example, can help accomplish. We'll have a look. Next slide. Safer shared workspaces. So maybe there's a curtain drawn.
The pandemic has affected the way architects design. It has forced them to accommodate multiple conditions. Designing in a way that can bring home and work together in a flexible way is important now. The wall partition depicted in this image is one that transforms from a divider, dividing a living room and an office space, and transforms it into a sleeping room.
Remote work and virtual socializing from home. Here we have full circle, reposturing your work at home. So you wake up, dress for work, walk around the block, and return to home to work from home. So we have the full circle. Here we have, from an earlier slide, textile production at home, from home, spinners, weavers, and dyers. And now I'd like to bring on Teya Kabalashvili to read a few slides.
We are also bringing museums, galleries, zoos, and parks to the home via virtual tours, supporting the continuation of cultural discourse. Next slide. This slide shows a digital immersive experience and virtual augmented reality. Through perception manipulation and controlled environment, the way we interact with the world and perceive ourselves is changing. And our physical infrastructure has become the essential nervous system of our cities and world. Next slide. Online virtuality transformed the world, bringing people from around the world into one room. The world becomes one room. There is also the first place, enabled by a device, a mirror in everyone's pocket, with the power to collapse all spaces into one.
Chapter 8, we envision with a renewed awareness of what makes for a healthier city. So many things to consider, but let's start with the obvious. Chapter 9, we act. The end. Thank you for joining us.